am Cheryl Holcomb-McCoy, the Vice Dean of Academic Affairs and also Professor of Counseling and Human Development here at Johns Hopkins. And it is such a pleasure to be here this afternoon to welcome you, but also to begin and to facilitate this discussion on education reform with two of our most prolific professors and writers in the country on education reform. Both of our presenters, Dr. Bob Balfanz and Dr. Bob Slavin, I call them the Bobs, each will share information about their research and the impact it's having on the national landscape. As their bios are also on the maps that you have when you enter the school, I'd like to still give you a brief introduction of each of our speakers. Dr. Slavin is currently the director of the Center for Research and Reform in Education at the Johns Hopkins University School of Education. He's also a part-time professor at the Institute for Effective Education at the University of York in England. And he's also the chairman of the Success for All Foundation. Bob, like I said before, is considered one of the nation's top education researchers. He has authored or co-authored more than 300 articles and book chapters on such topics as cooperative learning, comprehensive school reform, ability grouping, school and classroom organization, desegregation, mainstreaming, research review, and it goes on and on. He has received a number of awards and honors, including the American Educational Research Association's Raymond Cattell Early Career Award for programmatic research and the James Bryant Conant Award from the Education Commission of the States. He is a member of the National Academy of Education, and he's also an AERA Fellow. Dr. Bob Balfanz, the other Bob, is a senior research scientist and also a professor here at the Johns Hopkins University School of Education, where he is also co-director of the Talent Development Secondary Program and co-director of the Everyone Graduates Center, and also co-operator of the Baltimore Talent Development High School, an innovation high school operated in partnership with Baltimore City Schools. In addition, he is a leader and a co-founder of Diplomas Now, which is the proven strategy for turning around some of America's toughest schools. He has published widely on secondary school reform, high school dropouts, early warning systems, and instructional interventions in high-poverty schools. He is also a frequent speaker on dropout prevention and early warning indicators as a strategy to help students not fail in school. Dr. Balfanz is the first recipient of the Alliance for Excellent Education's Everyone's a Graduate Award. In February 2013, he was named as one of 10 champions of change by the White House for his commitment to furthering education opportunities among African American students. And I remember Bob, I was so thrilled to see him on TV, well, in the movies on Waiting for Superman. As you heard Dean Andrews state earlier, the School of Education has experienced significant recognition for our research efforts, which is reflected in our latest ranking of the U.S. News and World Report as the #2 School of Education. Collectively, the Bobs, Dr. Slavin and Dr. Balfanz, were awarded over $100 million in Investing in Innovation, or I3 funding, and we're most proud of them. Now I'd like to turn over the dialogue to the Bobs, and what the format of the rest of this hour will be. Both of them will talk for about 20 minutes on an issue related to education reform, and then we'll open it up for questions, for a little Q&A. And I'll sort of act like Oprah and go around and ensure that you get your questions in, and then we can get your questions answered, okay? Dr. Slavin?
So you want to give me a signal when I'm like this?
I'll do like
this.
Oh, thank you, Cheryl. Very nice to be here and talk to folks from the hometown and people who are colleagues and others who are supporters of the very important work that's going on throughout the School of Education. It's rather extraordinary to have seen the changes in the School of Education just over the very recent years. And it's wonderful to have the opportunity to shape something that's never existed before, that is building on the sound foundations that existed here, but able to do things that others haven't done because we're new, as in many ways, in doing the, in trying to create a school of education as though one had never existed before. As you know, from the ground up, what would you create today to try to contribute to the greatest degree to the quality of education that our students receive? My intention today is to talk about one aspect of the work that we've been doing for many years, which has to do with children who are struggling to learn to read in the early grades. I know that you hear a great deal these days about the importance of reading by third grade. The Casey Foundation has a big project on this topic. And a rather extraordinary thing has happened, which is that a number of states, I think about 35 states right now, either have or are about to pass legislation that requires that children are reading at grade level by third grade, or else they have to be retained. Some of the states are even contributing some money at a time when they don't have any money to help schools to ensure that children are going to be successful by third grade in reading. Now, the reason for this is clear to anyone who knows anything at all about children or education. We know, not only from research, but from just plain common sense, that children who fail to learn to read in the early grades are going to be at risk throughout their time in school. They are likely to lose motivation, to fail not only in reading itself, but in other subjects. They are likely to find other ways to develop a positive self-image, and those ways may involve delinquency, or they may involve kind of turning themselves off. If they don't get captivated by something early on, other than reading, then they're likely to slip from failing in reading in the early grades into a very negative pattern of outcomes later on. Failing or succeeding in reading in the early grades is not a guarantee that you will be a wonderful student and a successful person throughout your lifetime. But failing to learn to read is more or less a guarantee that you're going to have to struggle mightily for a very long time in the education system and then beyond. The likelihood of dropout, of delinquency, of drug taking, of early pregnancy, just about any bad outcome you can think of is vastly increased by failing to learn to read in the early grades. Now, what's striking about this problem of learning to read in the early grades is that there is probably no aspect of education research on anything practical on which we know as much as about early reading. There has been vast amounts of research on a wide variety of solutions to this problem that have identified a number of very effective solutions. And yet, these solutions remain rare. They remain relatively rare in practice. There's a great deal we know that we do not use. One of the things that I talk about a great deal, and that I was thinking about talking about today, and then thought, no, I better focus on something more pragmatic. But I talk a lot about the importance of evidence-based reform, the importance of using evidence to make decisions about the programs and practices that we use with children to try to ensure their success in all of education, in all subjects, in all grade levels, and so on. But one of the responses that people often make, if I start talking about, we need to use evidence to find the best ways to teach algebra, or we need to use evidence to find the best ways to teach elementary science, or we need to use evidence to, whatever you want to choose, one of the responses that people often make is, well, we don't really know that much. We don't have that much evidence for particular programs or practices. And until we know a great deal more, we really are not in a position to take action. Well, excuse me, I don't think that's true of algebra or elementary science or other fields, but it's definitely not true of early reading. We have many different solutions. We know a great deal about what works best and what does not in early reading. So my intention today is to talk a bit about what we know about early reading from the research and what that should mean in terms of thinking about how, at the policy level, as educators, we need to take this kind of evidence into account. So the research I'm about to talk to you about has to do with a review of the research that my colleague and I did, in which we used a method called best evidence synthesis, in which we looked at the entire literature on programs and practices that have some evidence of effectiveness to try to synthesize that research. The review itself is a scientific process. The idea is to try to use a consistent set of standards for what's included and what's not included, a consistent set of procedures for deciding how to treat the evidence that already exists. So this is not new research. It's a way of reviewing research that people all over the world are doing. In conducting this review, one of the key principles is that we began with an exhaustive search. In other words, our intention was to try to find every article that had ever been written. I think back to 1980 was our criterion, but every article that had been written that could possibly meet our inclusion criteria. So that our only criterion was that the article had to be available in English, although the study could have been done anywhere in the world. But if it was available in English, then we included it for review. As is always the case in these kinds of reviews, we produced hundreds of initial articles, of which only a smaller subset met our inclusion standards, but we wanted to be sure that we weren't missing anything. So we looked in all of the journals, we looked at dissertations, we looked at unpublished technical reports, we looked at publishers' websites, we looked at every place where reports might exist. This is really critical because if you just look at published things, you always get too rosy a picture in any area, because it's much more likely that things will be published if they get positive results. So if you want to be able to look at the good, the bad, and the ugly, you've got to look for things that may only exist as an obscure technical paper or as a dissertation or master's thesis or whatever it might be. So we were looking at grades 1 to 5, and we were focusing on low achievers. Our definition of low achievers was fairly broad. We were looking at children who were identified as struggling readers, identified as being in special education, identified as in the lowest third of their class on some measure. So this is not a narrow specification of kids who are at risk, but these are clearly kids who are having difficulties in school to a greater or lesser degree. We focused on studies in which there was a control group, that is, there was something that was done, some kind of program or practice was given to one group of kids, and then there was a control group of very similar kids or schools that was compared to those kids. Ideally, either the students or the schools were assigned at random to receive the program or not receive the program. That would be what you would expect in a medical study and is increasingly taking place in education. But we did accept studies in which there were matched procedures, meaning that there was a group of kids or teachers or schools that were using program X, and then you would go out and find very similar students or teachers or schools to compare to the students who were receiving the program. They had to be well matched at the beginning on some kind of a pretest, and the post-test had to be independent of the treatment. So sometimes publishers, for example, will test out a program, but then they'll use their own test that's inherent to the program as the outcome measure, and obviously that gives a big advantage to the experimental program. So we didn't accept those kinds of measures. So this is a summary of what we found, and let me just kind of talk through this. Very interesting. The first two bars refer to one-to-one tutoring. Not a big surprise that one-to-one tutoring is tremendously effective. One of the things that is a surprise, however, is that it made an enormous difference whether the one-to-one tutoring had a strong focus on phonics or whether it did not. If you imagine that you can have a teacher who works one-to-one with kids and is giving the kid a lot of time and a lot of investment of energy and of building a relationship, that this will improve their reading, it does. These effect sizes that are at the top of the bars, you don't need to know what an effect size is, but more of them is better. It's not too bad in the non-phonetic programs, they're getting pretty good results. But the really big impact of tutoring is when people sit with the kids and help them to understand the alphabetic principle, to understand how letters go together into words and words go together into sentences, that they're predictable features of the English language that enable you to take letters and make them into words. This is really critical, and you'll see it across the board in these studies. One of the things I think that this tells us beyond use programs that have a strong phonetic element is the degree to which struggling readers are struggling 9 times out of 10 because they don't have this phonetic principle. They just didn't get it. They're not able to do it, or else they're not able to work phonics fast enough to be able to learn. In the later grades, there's more focus on comprehension and other aspects, but in the early grades, the kids who are failing are usually, overwhelmingly, failing because they're not getting phonics for one reason or another. Now, a natural thing that people would ask, do you have to have one-to-one? And another thing that they'll ask is, do you have to have certified teachers? The first two bars refer to tutoring that's provided by certified teachers. Particularly, you may have heard of the Reading Recovery Program, very popular one-to-one program that uses very extensively trained one-to-one tutoring strategies. But there are many others as well that do that, and they also find very good results. But it's reasonable to ask, how much could you accomplish using paraprofessionals or volunteers? As well as, could you do it in a small group? The answer is that you can succeed in helping kids who are struggling in reading using one-to-one tutoring from paraprofessionals. Again, these 0.24 effect size is not too bad. It is well worth doing. Research, in particular, if you think about research on the uses of paraprofessionals. I hope none of you are paraprofessionals. If you are, don't listen to this because it's very discouraging. But the research on the effectiveness of paraprofessionals is that they don't make any difference at all. That the ordinary use of paraprofessionals does not make any difference. However, paraprofessionals can be effective as tutors. So I'm not saying send paraprofessionals home, but paraprofessionals can be very effective in doing one-to-one tutoring, and by the way, also in doing small group tutoring for children who are struggling. Well-trained, well-monitored paraprofessionals to be sure, but it doesn't require a certified teacher in order to provide an effective tutoring for kids. Can you do it in small groups? The answer is yes. You don't get the monster impacts that you do with one-to-one, but a well-trained person who works in very small groups. And now we're talking here about groups of perhaps 2, 3, 4. We're not talking about groups of 15, which is oftentimes what happens to kids in Title I remedial programs. But in very small groups, you can get impacts that are not too shabby. These programs that are successful use phonetic strategies once again. They're very intensive. But because paraprofessionals are so much less expensive than certified teachers, you can provide kids with more, many more kids and much more time if you use paraprofessionals to provide tutoring to kids. Success for All is our program that we designed here at Johns Hopkins many years ago. It's a program that has a lot more than tutoring. It's not only designed for children who are struggling in reading. It works with whole schools that are in poverty, but in a high poverty school, not all children are struggling in reading, of course. But these are the numbers that apply to those kids who are in those high poverty schools but are struggling in reading at the beginning. This program makes a very big difference and has been evaluated many times all around the world and found to be very effective. What it provides is a method for teaching reading with a strong emphasis on cooperative learning, strong emphasis on phonics. So the idea is to try to prevent most kids who are having difficulties from having difficulties in the first place. But it also provides interventions for kids who are struggling, such as one-to-one tutoring, either using a paraprofessional or using a certified teacher if you can get one, or small group tutoring using a computer-assisted strategy that we use now, all of which have been independently evaluated and found to be effective as well. So I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, but this is a different kind of an approach that's not just focused on the individual kids who are struggling, but working in the whole school to try to prevent kids from having difficulty in situations like very high poverty schools where so many children are likely to have trouble in reading if you don't do something special, that it's not sensible to try to patch them up one at a time. You want to do something in the school as a whole and then provide tutoring for the hopefully small number of kids who are still going to have difficulty. And then big disappointment for those of you who are big fans of technology, that computer-assisted instruction for struggling readers is simply not very effective, and studies find that over and over and over again in all different kinds of technology. I believe in technology. I love technology. We do a lot of work with technology, but nobody has found a technology to this day that I'm aware of that has made a difference, much of a difference in student reading for kids who are struggling in reading, nor for kids who are not struggling in reading, by the way, and you can get me going on that. So I mentioned that the importance of phonics in all of these programs. There is no program that has been found to be effective consistently that doesn't have a very strong emphasis on phonics. And where specific studies have been done that compare studies with a strong phonetic emphasis to those without that emphasis, there's a very big difference in outcomes. So that's something that I think is true across the board. Teachers versus paraprofessionals, you'll be glad to know that teachers do better than paraprofessionals. Do they do better per dollar? You can argue about that. Economists will argue about it. But basically, you get what you pay for. Certified teachers do better, but paraprofessionals should not be discounted because they can be very effective with good training and good monitoring. One-to-one versus small group, I've already talked about. Classroom approaches versus pull-out. I think that you want to have a combination. You want to be working with classroom approaches to the extent you can to prevent kids from getting into difficulty, and then be ready to pull out or to work with kids. We provide one-to-one or small group intervention. One interesting question has to do with long-term impacts For preventing kids from getting into trouble in the early grades, of course, you'd say, well, let's do whatever's necessary. It's obviously so important, but it's still a question of great interest. What are the long-term impacts of a given intervention in the early grades? Here's an interesting graph that makes you think hard about this. This is a study that was done in London it was an evaluation of reading recovery. Reading recovery, as typically happens, was extremely effective in first grade. But when the kids got, in reading recovery, you get 60 lessons typically in first grade, and it gets you up to the level of your class most often. And then nothing else ever happens again after that. The hope is now you're at grade level, the school will treat you like it would treat anybody else at grade level, and you'll maintain your position there. The fact is, this is not what happens, and there's other studies that show this as well. That what happens is that the tremendous gains that were made in first grade are gradually lost, and by age 10 or fifth grade, the level of difference is quite small. This is a graph showing data from Success for All. Actually, this is from Baltimore. And what's different about this, this is not whether Success for All is wonderful or not, but what's different is that Success for All continues to intervene. So it's not just a first grade program. The most expensive part of Success for All does take place in first grade, just as it does in reading recovery. The difference is that in second grade, third grade, all the way up through eighth grade, Success for All continues to provide professional development, monitoring of children's performance, parent involvement, and other kinds of services to keep kids on the right path. I use the analogy sometimes of, if you're making a stew, and you put the stew on at a very low temperature, it will never boil. At least I don't think so. Or at least it'll take a very, very long time. If you put it on for a short time at a very high temperature and bring it up to the boil and then turn it off, it'll never cook. What you got to do is put a lot of energy into it at the beginning and then maintain it over a period of time. And I think in terms of trying to see that kids are successful not only in first grade or before third grade, but that they maintain and build on that success over time, that takes more than just doing tutoring or something in the first grade. You've got to build on that and be sure that kids are being monitored and getting high quality instruction later on. So I think that that an overall strategy would focus first on providing top quality professional development, materials, phonetic strategies for teachers in all grades, classroom teachers, to try to prevent problems from occurring, to be ready to provide tutoring or small group intervention for kids who are struggling, using either certified teachers or paraprofessionals, and to be ready to provide, to continue beyond the tutoring, beyond whatever intervention you make, for many years, so that the kids will come to the end of elementary school or the end of middle school in good shape, successful students who never even knew that they had a problem because it was intervened on initially, and they achieved success and maintained success throughout their time in school. So your job now, if you're involved in anything having to do with policy or practice, is get out there and make that happen. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. So I'm going to pick up the baton from Bob and say that once we get kids to read, our next big challenge is getting them to graduate from high school. And I'm going to talk today just briefly about using evidence to help us enable all students to graduate from high school, prepare for college and career. And the reason this is important is there's really no work in the 21st century for high school dropouts anymore, right? There is no path to prosperity if you don't have a high school diploma, and there's no way to support a family on the job that you could have. So it's bad for them and it's bad for us, right? But to say that everyone is going to graduate high school prepared for college and career is really a new challenge for the educational system. When this building was built, schools weren't designed to ensure that every student would graduate high school prepared for college and career. They were designed to say some go to college, some go to the trades, some go to what was then called commercial, become a bookkeeper, and some, go out and just, take factory jobs. So we have to design our schools differently when we have a new outcome we face. But to do that, we have to, in a smart way, we argue here at the School of Education, you have to use evidence, right? Not just our intuitions, not just our thoughts on what might be a good way, but where does the evidence lead us? And so to do that, we have to stay with these questions for a long time, right? You're not going to get an answer in a week or a year on how to do that. You need sustained programmatic research that builds on itself. And I just want to give you a little case example of how we've done that in the group I work with at the Center for the Social Organization of Schools, and really how we've done this over the past 15 years to get where we are now, to think we have a better idea on how to do this. So what we try to do fundamentally is to really connect first, figuring out what the challenge is. What is it going to take to get all our kids to graduate from college and career? Then test those ideas out in schools and develop models and tools that work, refine them, improve them, evaluate them, throw out the ones that don't work, keep the ones that do, and almost like software, keep building a new generation of model every few years as we learn more. And then also try to influence policy to create the conditions to help scale those tools and ideas, right? So it's really integrating research to practice to policy is one of the unique things we do here at the School of Education. So how are we going to figure out to get all these kids to graduate college and career? Well, when I started working with our team and our colleagues, they had spent about the prior 5 years sort of looking at the knowledge base, figuring out what would be the components of whole school reform for high poverty high schools. And they had built a pilot school here in Baltimore at Patterson High School, and it had some good initial success, and people wanted to learn about it. So that's about when I joined the team. So I was going out and I was visiting schools in Philadelphia and Detroit and Cleveland, and what struck me is that inside they all look the same, right? In crazy ways. That they would have as many kids in the hallways as in the classrooms. They would have 300, 400, 500 kids in the 9th grade, and then a wild celebration when 150 kids would graduate. And we asked ourselves, okay, did we just stumble on bad wine, like a few really troubled schools, or is this a big problem? So we asked ourselves, how big is this problem? Because in order to solve it at a national level, we have to first understand its scale. And we looked, and we found is that we couldn't use graduation rates, because at that point, everybody measured them their own way. Basically, any state could figure out any measure of graduation rates, and it was okay. And there wasn't a lot of accountability for improving graduation rates. So we had this intuition, though, that we knew that we saw these huge 9th grade classes and these very small 12th grade classes. And we knew that we could actually get data on enrollments, because they have to report to the federal government how many kids are enrolled in each grade. So we knew that for all schools, we could actually see how many had many, many 9th graders and very, very few seniors. And when we ran those numbers, we found that, in fact, you could make the case that 10% of schools were producing half the dropouts, and really up to 75% of the minority dropouts. And this became very influential at a policy level, because it told folks that a targeted effort could make a difference. You wouldn't have to reform 20, 30,000 high schools to make a big difference. You'd have to totally transform 2,000 high schools. And that made it seem much more doable to policymakers. At the same time, we were building our model and getting evidence that we could in fact do things in these schools to improve and make things better. And those two things together over time played out to right now, it is now federal policy that any high school that has a graduation rate below 60% has to have fundamental reform. And that was really just built up from those insights and the work of others, that we have these schools, they are really crazy, they are really dysfunctional, they are essentially, the term we use that caused a lot of controversy, dropout factories. So we actually added a term to the lexicon along the way. But there was only a small number, and you could galvanize around it and have a big impact. So that's part one of the story. We know where the schools are that produce most of the dropouts. Then as we kept working along, we figured doing our whole school reform model and doing our evidence, that we could take a school from lousy to decent. We could go from a 50% grad rate to a 70% grad rate. But that still said a lot of kids are still falling through the wayside, right? We're not all everybody's ready for college and career yet with that. So we looked at the data and tried to figure out, well, what are we missing? What more could we be doing? Why isn't this even getting better results? And just almost for happenstance, someone had asked us to do a little study at that time of what are the characteristics of students who get arrested in high school. And we ran some numbers, and we found for 9th graders that get arrested in high school that 2/3 of them in 8th grade were failing all their classes and only coming to school 2/3 of the time. So they were really highly disengaged in 8th grade, barely attending school, and then in 9th grade they were getting in trouble. And these kids had a 5% graduation rate. But what we found is that in the data, there was a larger number of kids in 8th grade that were failing their classes and only coming 1/3 of the time, that didn't get arrested in high school or any time, and had the same 5% graduation rate. So that told us that you could be so off track in 8th grade that whether you get arrested or not in high school didn't impact if you would graduate from high school, because your odds were already essentially zero. So that sent us off on another quest to figure out how early were kids signaling that they were disengaged from school, that they were on a path to drop out, not to graduate, arguing the earlier we could intervene, the better off we're going to be. So we ran a bunch of numbers. We followed waves and waves of kids from 6th grade through to graduation, and 3 things stood out that anybody that works in a school would say, oh my God, like you spent all that time to find the obvious. But sometimes proving the obvious is really what we do to help move things forward. And it turned out that students as early as 6th grade that were missing a month or more of school, that were getting in sustained mild misbehavior, or that were failing math and English, absent intervention, only had about a 25% chance of graduating. That they were 12 years old, and unless we did something, they were going to be the ones that were falling off the path to graduation. They were going to be the ones walking the halls in the 9th grade. They were going to be the ones not making it to graduation in 12th grade. And the other insight we picked up from this is that when you ran the numbers, there's hundreds of kids in the middle schools that feed these high schools that produce the dropouts that have these off-track indicators. It's not 10 or 20 or 30. If it were 10 or 20 or 30 again, the standard great American high school, secondary school could wrap itself around it. A counselor could take 20 kids. A social worker could deal with 30 kids. But a social worker can't deal with 300 kids, right? There's just no way you can manage that caseload. So then it becomes triage as opposed to helping all students. So this again fed back into our model building, and we said, how can we combine whole school reform with dealing with this scale and intensity of student need problems? In fact, there's these group of kids in high poverty environments by the secondary grades that need a good lesson every day, first and foremost, but also need something else, something to figure out why they're not coming to school, something else to solve the behavioral issues, something else to figure out how can you be in 6th grade. It's really hard to fail in 6th grade, if you remember, right? That if you struggle and you do better at the end, the teacher worries about the end, not the beginning. If you sort of try, they find a way to get you through. I mean, in high school, like you fail. But it's hard to fail in middle school. So that's a really strong signal that something's amiss. And if we don't intervene, it won't self-correct itself. Because that was always the hope. It's crazy middle grades. Kids are off the rails. We all knew half of us were crazy in middle school. We got over it. They'll grow out of it. But the evidence was clear that absent intervention, it doesn't get better, it gets worse. Because that student who was just failing math in 6th grade, by high school is failing everything. And it's still intervenable, but much more challenging. So then we got to thinking, how do we solve this? And then we thought, well, we need to bring in partners that can let us reach 200 kids in a day that need sort of nagging and nurturing. Glad to see you in school today. Did you get your work done? Let's help you get your work done. You and Mr. Brown are having trouble in social studies. You think he's mean. He thinks you're sarcastic. We've got to work that out. And we partnered with National Service Corps members. We'll get a team of 10 to 15 recent college graduates who could follow 10 to 15 kids throughout the school day. We also then partnered with folks that could do integrated student supports, case management, to deal with the kids that had such strong out-of-school needs. If we didn't solve them, it didn't matter how much we told them, come to school every day. And the key to all this, and I just want to focus on, it gets us back to the data and integrating the research with the practice to the policy, is that once we found these signals, which turns out to be the ABCs of dropping out, attendance, behavior, course performance, we work with schools to build data systems to use this data to let people know that students are just starting to demonstrate these behaviors. They're just starting to miss a few days of school. They're just starting to get in trouble. They're on the path to failing. And then we organize structures in the school, doing the whole school reform that Bob talked about as being essential besides just very narrow strategic things, to bring teams of teachers that share common sets of students, along with the core members who support them and the social workers, and on a regular basis reviewing this early warning indicator data so they could see if students were starting to fall off track, to see the kids that were off track, were they getting back on track, was the intervention working, and if not, we got to go to plan B and not stay with plan A just because that was our only plan we have. And this sort of early warning indicator meeting created a whole technology. Suddenly we have 10 adults sitting around talking about one kid, which totally flips the physics of most secondary schools, where you have one teacher that has 150 kids they share with no one. And they can talk math with their colleagues, which is really important, but they can talk kids with no one. So basically they can grab a couple of kids that, through their hearts and efforts to help, and many, many kids fall through the cracks. So by building that technology, that practice-based technology, learning how it works in real schools, we developed a tool that was supported by the data that would then let adults do their jobs better in schools to higher outcomes. And then we keep evidencing the data, will that work? And as Bob said through this, and others, through this thing called Investing in Innovation, a big federal program that will take to scale or to validate promising practices, we're now putting this model, which we call diplomas now, in a very large randomized field trial. So very much like a medical study. So right now we're in 10 districts, 40 schools in the experimental, 40 schools in the control, 80 schools all over, randomly picked which one you're at, to sort of really build the evidence base to validate this model, to show this is a better way to keep kids on track by simultaneously doing whole school reform, improving instruction, improving professional development, all those things that Bob showed to keep the intervention going, but also figuring a way to mobilize a second shift of adults, if you will, using data to provide those kids the other supports they need to come to school regularly, to stay out of trouble, to pass their courses, and therefore be on the pipeline to actually graduate high school, and also to be able to learn more challenging material. And then that feeds back to what Bob also alluded to, this idea of this growing movement for sort of an evidence-based approach to research, policy, practice, and program building that is really the center of what the School of Education is building its efforts around. It's sort of the unschool of education, if you will, and is a way to really try to move the whole ball forward by saying we're doing where evidence tells us to go, but in a way that's validated by work in actual schools. So it's evidence-based but practice-validated, and then using that to say we've got to build our policies around that. Because we spend like huge amounts of money on Title I, which is the federal program every year, which is supposed to be, its purpose is to alleviate the impacts of poverty. So schools that have high impacts of poverty can do basic education successfully. But over time, a lot of that money has gone to non-evidence-based strategies. So it's a big federal investment that's not really doing what it should do. And ultimately, the idea is to build enough evidence base to make it so compelling that people just recognize it's crazy to do what we keep doing. We have to actually follow the evidence to make things better. Thanks.